Okay, folks, we're going to just start now. So first of all, I'd just like to welcome everyone to what's the first event of the Smithfield and Stony Batter People's History Project of 2014. Today's event is Oliver Bond and the King Killers of Pill Lane. Our guest speaker is Fergus Whelan, the historian and author of Dissent Into Treason, a book about a hidden history of the Protestant Dissenters and their involvement in the revolutionary movement established in 1791, the United Irishmen. Just before we begin, I just want to make a quick announcement about some stuff that's coming up in the History Project. Kind of building on our success, we've been going for about a year now, and we've organised lots of meetings about ordinary people in Smithfield and Stony Batter, and this year rather, we're hoping to build on those successes, and in the summer of 2014, towards the late summer, we're hoping to organise a history and culture festival in the area where we hopefully over a weekend we'll have lots of meetings like this, music, and different cultural events. But to organise, we're hoping to do it on quite a big scale, and to organise something like that, obviously we need lots of involvement from people like yourselves. So next Saturday, this day week, we're organising a meeting in here on the 22nd. So the idea behind the meeting is that we'll outline our plans for this festival, and then we'd love to hear what you think about it, and hopefully to get everyone involved in organising what could be a great event next summer. So if you want to know more about that, there's going to be a contact sheet going around, or you can come up to anyone on the committee. There's people at the back, there's Paul over there, and there's lots of us around the room. If you want to come up to any of us after the meeting to talk about that. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Fergus now.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming. As you can see, the title of my talk today is Oliver Bond, the King Killers at Pill Lane. I decided to add the Protestant Dissenters of Church Street, Smithfield in the Revolution of 1798, because I realised in sort of advertising the event that most people probably wouldn't know where Pill Lane was. The graphic there is a very well-known graphic. That's the arrest of Lord Edward Fitzgerald on the 17th of May 1798. Probably more accurately, it should be the arrest of citizen Edward Fitzgerald, because in fact a couple of years before the arrest took place, citizen Edward dropped his title Lord in the fit of exuberance in Paris after the French Revolution. He was a brother of the Duke of Leinster, the Premier Peer in Ireland at the time. A couple of days after this incident, he was wounded. He fought fiercely when he was captured. He wounded two of his assailants, and he was shot in the shoulder by Major Suhr, and he died on the 4th of June 1798 in great agony, both mental and physical. Sorry about the quality of this now, but this is a map of the area, and I'm trying to show you where Pill Lane is. This is Smithfield. This is where you are now. This is the Cobblestone. This is Pill Lane. And basically, Pill Lane runs where Chancery Street runs now, where the Lewis comes along by Chancery Street. In the 18th century, Pill Lane was the Grafton Street of Dublin. It was a business centre. There were lots of shops there, and in those days, things weren't manufactured in factories and brought into shops through warehouses and all that. The stuff they sold in the shops was actually sort of manufactured on the premises, and quite often the owners of the premises both lived on them. Sometimes their workforce did as well, but their shops, their living area and their manufacturing area were all together. And this, as I say, Pill Lane was a very prosperous area, as we will see in a minute. It was also, and from our point of view, it was the address in Dublin where more United Irishmen had addresses in Pill Lane than any. So it was the greatest concentration of United Irishmen in the 18th century. Other things that might be important that will come up in the course of the talk is this. You can hardly see it, but halfway between Pill Lane and Smithfield is St Michael's Church, and at the back of St Michael's Church, which goes on to Bow Street here, literally 100 yards from where we're sitting, is the grave of Oliver Bond, who we'll hear a lot about in the course of this talk. And just down here slightly is the great Strand Street Presbyterian meeting house, more of which later. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead. This is a description of what was going on in Pillane in 1795. After the United Irishmen had been banned. The United Irishmen was started as a sort of a radical gentleman's club in 1791, but it was later banned and went underground, and it was reorganised in 1795. And this is what an informer was saying about Pillane in 1795. He described the committee that existed in Pillane as the most important Republican society. About 70 members. Men of great property, that's important, men of great property, right? Extremely cautious who they admitted to membership. Clearly they weren't cautious enough. At their meetings they imitate the Jacobins of France. They refer to each other as citizen, and even the waiters are referred to by the same name. Now, sorry again, you can hardly see this, but you can take my word for it. These are all names of people who have been identified as United Irishmen. And I have to say that this isn't primary research by me. There's a number of people, Thomas Bartlett I think did some work, and R.B. McDowell on the Dublin Society of United Irishmen. But using those secondary sources, these were some of the people I was able to identify as having been involved with the United Irishmen in the Pillane area. Oliver Bond was a woolen merchant. Now, strictly, Oliver Bond didn't live in Pillane in the 1790s. His business premises was in Pillane. He lived across the river here in the area that's known as Oliver Bond Flats now. He was a very extremely wealthy woolen merchant who'd come to Dublin about 20 years before the 1790s and built up a major business. Initially he lived in Pillane, but he became so prosperous he was able to move to a bigger house across the river. But his business premises and most of his activity was carried on in Pillane. Samuel Gardner is the name under that. Again, an apologies for this. Samuel Gardner was was identified as president of the Pillane Committee. He was also, he was also a vestry member of the Strand Street Presbyterian Church, which I'll be telling you about in a couple of minutes. And all those names, I don't really need to go into, but every one of them has an address in Pillane, and you can see some of them are glovers, some of them are woolen merchants. One guy here, Maxwell, it's interesting because he's down as Maxwell was the church warden at St. Mickens. Now I thought that was very strange because St. Mickens is a classic established church location. But Maxwell, we know, was a Protestant dissenter, and he was a member of the Strand Street Presbyterian congregation. So it seems strange to me that somebody who was clearly a dissenter was a church warden. But what I believe, by talking to historians who know more about this than I do, what I believe the situation was, a church warden was almost like a local authority position, and you were obliged to fill it whether you wanted to fill it or not. So even though he was a Protestant dissenter, he could be forced to carry out the duties of a church warden. And in one way, that's probably a good thing, because otherwise they might have had problems finding somewhere to bury Oliver Bond after he was murdered. But more of that later. Now, this is the Presbyterian Church at Great Strand Street, where I've had the opportunity to have access to the records in this particular church. And at the top, I used this for an earlier lecture on a slightly different subject, but they're the names of some of the prominent United Irishmen who were associated with this church. First of all, William Drennan. He's a terribly important figure in the Society of United Irishmen. He's Belfast born, the son of a Presbyterian minister, but he came to Dublin around 1790 and lived in Dublin for more than a decade. He was the first person to suggest the founding of the Society of United Irishmen. He was also something of a poet, and he was the person who coined the term the Emerald Isle for Ireland. Underneath him then is Archibald Hamilton Rowan, probably the one of the most prominent of the early United Irishmen. His roots were in Presbyterian County Down. He was, at one stage, he was a member of the vestry committee at Strand Street. You'll see in a moment he played a major part in, to some extent, getting the United Irishmen banned and turned into a secret society. Oliver Bond, you already know something about him, we'll hear more about him later. And Eleanor Bond was his wife. Now that's one of the things about the Society of United Irishmen is that it was actually a misnomer, because there were women. It sounds like it was just a society for men and not a men's society. That's not true. Eleanor Bond was a prominent member of the society, and everywhere she went, she carried the Bible with her. But that wasn't because she was some sort of religious fanatic. It was handy to have the Bible when she was swearing other people into the secret society. And I think maybe in the course of the afternoon it might become clear to you, and certainly in my view, Eleanor Bond, her maiden name is Eleanor Jackson, was a woman of some substance. Henry Jackson was Eleanor Bond's father. He was also, and therefore Oliver Bond's father-in-law. He owned a major ironworks and foundry in the Church Street area, more of which later. Robert Holmes was a member of the Vestry Committee in Strand Street. He married in 1799, he married Mary Ann Emmett, Robert Emmett's sister. And they were married, I think, on the 20th of September 1799. Robert Emmett signed as a witness to the certificate, and that certificate turned up in the records of this church in the course of my research. She was also very active in politics, and her brother Thomas Addis Emmett was a member of this congregation. He married a woman called Jean Patton, who's the daughter of a Unitarian minister in Clonmel, and they had all their children. They had all their children baptised in Great Strand Street. In fact, the register that those baptisms are in is still in use in the Stephen's Green Unitarian Church to this day. But I want to tell you where Strand Street came from, because this is crucial to the story I have to tell you today. This is a sort of a family tree of Protestant dissent in Dublin. And maybe I better say something about what Protestant dissent is. I mean, basically, at the time of the revolution in England, the Cromwellian revolution against Charles I, there was actually two revolutions. There was a political revolution and there was a religious revolution. Because basically a large group of Protestants in England refused to accept the authority of the Church of England. They refused to accept bishops. They refused to accept the idea that there was a thing called church teaching. They refused to accept the idea that they would go to a church and they would be ministered by some guy appointed by a bishop, that they'd no say in his appointments. So they rejected the teachings of the Church of England. They rejected the structure of the Church of England. And to some extent that church was, they suffered after, in the Cromwellian time, that was fine, because the Church of England had been overthrown and the king had been overthrown. And what happens then is you've got a myriad of religious sects coming on the scene. You've got the Quakers, you've got the Baptists, you've got the Congregationalists and all of them have a couple of things in common, but one of the things that they have in common is they won't accept hierarchy. And they were regarded very much as, after the restoration of Charles II, as subversives, because as James I, I think, once said, no bishop. If you don't accept the bishop, no king. The attitude of the government at the Church of England at the time was these dissenters were basically subversive people. When did they come to Dublin? Cook Street, you know where Cook Street is, there at the back, over near Christ Church, the back of Adam and Eve's, whatever. A congregation starts there in 1650. There's a congregation in Wood Street that goes back to Elizabethan times. Nobody knows when it started, but what we do know is that Reverend John Owen preached there in 1650. Reverend John Owen came to Ireland with Oliver Cromwell's army, as did the people who set up the Cook Street. Oliver Cromwell came to Dublin in August 1649, and he stayed in Ireland for 9 months. So it's most likely that these congregations were set up when Cromwell was still in Ireland or shortly thereafter. Certainly John Owen comes to Ireland with Cromwell and leaves Ireland with him as well, but he preached in Wood Street when he was here. And in New Row, Samuel Martyr preaches in 1650. Now, when Charles I was executed, John Owen said, "It is the Lord's work and most marvellous in our eyes." This man, Samuel Martyr, that's a very famous Mather Martyr. There's a debate about how that's discussed, how that's pronounced. It's a very famous family in New England, the Mathers. In fact, his nephew is a fellow called Cotton Mather, who is he's probably the most well-known and notorious Puritan minister in America. The reason being that he played quite a negative role, let's say, in the murder of 19 innocent people for witchcraft in the famous Salem witchcraft trial. It was Cotton Mather, who a nephew of this man here, who justified the execution of the people at Salem. But Samuel Martyr, at once in the early part of the English Revolution, if you like, he preached the Fifth Monarchy. Now, the Fifth Monarchy was a very radical sect within the English Revolution, who basically believed that chopping the head off Charles I was opening the way for the rule of the saints, for the 1,000 years of perfect happiness on earth. They read the book of Revelation and believed what was in it, and believed it was prophecy, and they believed actually that they were perfecting human society by chopping the head off the king. So it's not really any wonder that the descendants here in Great Strand Street finally, as we'll see in a moment, come to be known by at least one individual as the king killers at Pill Lane. Another thing I want to say about the 18th century that you have to remember is that in those days people actually believed in God, you know, and they actually went to church regularly. And you have to remember that it's not like the modern time when people would say, "Oh, well, I believe in something," or you know, or but I'm not. You know, people in the 18th century believed in whatever their religious affiliation was, and they practiced it. So they constantly went to their places of worship and so on. Now, the United Irishmen is established in 1791, first of all in Belfast and then in November in Dublin. The atmosphere at the time was the fall of the Bastille was greeted with delight by all liberal opinion in England and in Ireland. And all those people who had been fighting for reform, etc., and looking for reform of Parliament, in those days, parliamentary seats and so on were given as gifts by landlords to people they wanted to give a gift. The ordinary people, of course, had no vote. Of course, no Catholic had a vote. Certainly in 1791 they didn't have a vote. No Catholic could hold certain offices of state. No Protestant Dissenter could hold offices of state. For instance, ironically in Ireland, a small number of the members of Parliament were elected Dissenters, but Dissenters in England couldn't be elected to the British House of Commons. So all these people who had been looking for reform and all were absolutely delighted when the Bastille fell, because the philosophers had been writing about France was an absolute monarchy. There was an established church. The early established church was the Catholic Church. The Bastille falls. A representative assembly of the people is set up. They say they're going to sort of have universal suffrage. They try to adopt the constitution where the king isn't the absolute monarch anymore. So in that atmosphere, all liberal opinion in the English-speaking world was delighted by and welcomed the French Revolution. And in the famous words of William Wordsworth, bliss was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. So the Society of United Irishmen starts in Belfast and Dublin, delighted by events in France and determined to bring about parliamentary reform and eventually, after some debate and soul searching, universal suffrage also. And initially, I don't want you to concentrate on that cartoon for a minute. Initially, the United Irishmen, in Dublin at any rate, the United Irishmen is a very respectable gentleman's club. They are all well-to-do people. They meet in places like the Taylor's Hall, at the Eagle Tavern, and they discuss events in France, and they write to reformers and dissenters in England and Scotland, and they issue proclamations on things like calling for reform, parliamentary reform, and calling for unity of Catholic and Protestant in the centre, calling for Catholic emancipation, if you like, and they have their nice little gentlemen's club, and they have their dates and so on. Now, then an event happens very nearby here that's represented in this cartoon. This is a contemporary cartoon that came out within a week of the events happening. About 200 yards from here, up where Green Street is and where Cuckoo Lane is, stood Newgate Prison. And Archibald Hamilton Rowan had been sentenced to 2 years there for seditious libel. The United Irishmen had issued a pamphlet that the government didn't like, and Rowan was made an example of, as it were. They sent him to Newgate for 2 years. But then he was approached by an Anglican clergyman who turned out to be working for the Committee of Public Safety in Paris. And the approach was about whether the French would be prepared to help the Irish reformers and the Irish Democrats and so on. And because of a little bit, I don't want to go into too much detail, but because of a number of slip-ups on Rowan's part, he ended up in a situation where the government had enough information on him to hang him if he hung around in jail. So he escaped from jail, and he eventually hides out in North County Dublin, and he escapes to France in a small fishing boat, and doesn't get back to Ireland for nearly 11 years. But that, as they say, is another story. This shows two versions of the escape, both of which are inaccurate. It shows him here jumping on a horse, and this is May Day outside Newgate Prison. There's a May Day bonfire, the people are dancing around the bonfire, and Tone jumps on his horse, shouting "Liberty or Death," and disappears into the smoke. This is him again getting into his wife's carriage. One of the other versions of the escape was that he swapped clothes with a servant, and the servants stayed in the prison, and Rowan got into his wife's carriage. Neither of those are accurate. The other thing is that the person who wrote who drew the cartoon is obviously very cynical about the security. The jailer here is asleep, the guard is drunk or asleep, and the two turnkeys are asleep. However, what's important about this is that this was the event that gave the government the chance they wanted to ban the Society of United Irishmen. So the Society of United Irishmen, according to some people at any rate, ceased to exist after Rowan's escape. However, I think it's Jim Smith, the historian, tells us, he said about 50 members of the Society met in Henry Jackson's house in Church Street, beside Pill Lane, in October 1795. At this meeting, John Shears proposed reorganising the Society into 15-man sections, which would each delegate a representative to a council or a central committee. So this appears to be the re-emergence of the secret society, that eventually the revolutionary society that gets involved in the rebellion in 1798. And as I say, according to Smith and there's lots of other sources to suggest this also, this all happens in Henry Jackson's house rather near here. Now, unfortunately for the society, this man was very, very well aware of what was going on. This man is called Francis Higgins, also known as the Sham Squire. He started life as an attorney's assistant, discovered that he had very good handwriting or calligraphy or whatever, and decided that that would be very useful as a forger. So he forged a load of documents to imply that he had a good job with the government and that he had land in County Down. He went with these documents to meet a Jesuit priest called Father Shortall, and he told Shortall that he was a very wealthy Protestant and that he wanted to become a Catholic, but it had to be secret, because if he let it out, his Protestant family would disinherit him. So he fooled the priest anyway, and he went along to confession, and he was turned into a Catholic. Then he asked the priest to get him a wife of the true religion. So the Catholic priest procured an unfortunate girl called Mary Archer, whose parents were rich and Catholic, and she was married off much against her will to this guy. She ran away from him on the first night, and you wouldn't blame her, I suppose. But he raced after her and ended up assaulting his new mother-in-law and breaking her leg. So he stood trial for that, and they went very easy on him. He stood trial for the forgery and all the rest of it, but they went very easy on him for one reason, that the judge and all the jury and everybody else were Protestants. He was a Protestant, and archers were Catholics. And the way the judiciary turned at the time, who do these Catholics think they are, trying to get control of Protestant land? So he got off very lightly, but in one way he got off lightly because he got a very light sentence. But on the other hand, the judge did call him the Sham Squire. And in the nature of these things, he was never known, although he lived a very long life and he became very wealthy and all the rest of it, he was never known by anything else as the Sham Squire. But by this time, by the time the Pill Lane Committee is operating, the Sham Squire has a lot of informers out in the field trying to find out anything he can about them. By this stage, he's also the editor of the Freeman's Journal, and he was a judge, but he was keeping a very close eye on the Pill Lane people. The Sham took particular interest in the committee that met in the White Horse Inn at Pill Lane. And I said to you earlier that Pill Lane was a bustling commercial street at this stage. Oliver Bond and his father-in-law Henry Jackson were leading members of the Pill Lane Committee. The Sham dubbed them, and it was he who first dubbed them in 1797, as far as I can see, the King Killers of Pill Lane. If the Sham had any redeeming features, it was that he had a good sense of humour. And his reports to the Dublin Castle could be quite funny. For instance, some of the names he had on the group was the Marats of Pill Lane. That's obviously a reflection, a reference to Jean-Paul Marat, the French revolutionary who was killed in his baths by, I think, Charlotte Corday or whoever. Right? But he was an extreme. He was on the extreme left of the French Revolution, and the Sham used to call the committee in Pill Lane here the Marats of Pill Lane. This one, he called them the Association of Eating and Drinking Democratic Citizens. And where he came up with that was that Oliver Bond, early on in the life of the United Irishmen, Oliver Bond had, and a fellow called Simon Butler, they had said something that insulted Parliament and were imprisoned as a result. And the United Irishmen then decided that they'd have a lottery between them. And remember, these are all well-to-do people. And the lottery was, if you pulled the ticket in the lottery, you had to go into the prison and put a banquet on for the 2 prisoners and 12 other people. It's said, depending on which version of it you believe, it's said that Oliver Bond's drink bill for the short time he was in prison was either £200 or £500. Now, William Drennan's annual salary in 1791 was £200. So if you believed the first figure, it was 2.5 times the doctor's salary that Oliver Bond drank when he was in prison. And Martha McTeer, William Drennan's sister, was very worried that Simon Butler was a member of the established church, and she thought it was him that was throwing all the drink into Oliver Bond and corrupting the good Presbyterian Oliver Bond. But obviously the Association of Eating and Drinking Democratic Citizens comes from those banquets that the United Irishmen had when Bond was in Newgate. And of course remember that the Sham Squire was also a newspaper editor, and he used to make plenty of references to the eating and drinking that was going on in Newgate at the time, which was quite damaging to the United Irishmen at the time, because in fact most of the workers in Dublin at that time were actually starving. So there was food riots and starving people out in the streets, and the United Irishmen were in the prison and living it up. And of course the other name that the Sham came up with for the Pill Lane people was the King Killers of Pill Lane. Just a little bit more, well, this is what one informer said about Bond, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him. He was wealthy, popular, of affable manners, made 600,000 a year by his business, had great dominion over the blacksmiths and other desperate fellows. He was called King Bond, and would, on the downfall of government, have been the head of everything. This reference to blacksmiths and desperate fellows, it never ceases to amaze me, although I'm well used to it now. In the eyes of the social hierarchy at the end of the 18th century, and in the eyes of the newspapers at the time, it was actually a crime to be poor. You know, there was no concept of the ordinary, decent, working class person back in the 18th century. If you were poor or you were working class, you were described as a desperate fellow, the rabble, or as, what's his name, Edmund Burke used to say, the swinish multitude. There doesn't seem to have been any concept amongst the social hierarchy back in those days that ordinary people who were poor and worked for a living could be decent citizens. Jackson, his father-in-law, owned a northern foundry at 180 Church Street. His company carried out major public contracts, but also manufactured pikes. He was producing cannonballs designed to be fired by French cannon. He was reported to be producing those diabolical instruments called cats, invented for the destruction of cavalry. As far as I can tell, a cat is something like a ball bearing, but it has spikes in it. And apparently, if you roll them out onto the street, it terrifies horses. And the idea of it was, obviously, these guys were planning a revolution in the streets of Dublin, and they were planning that they'd have to deal with cavalry. And Jackson's way and his workforce way of handling that was to make these diabolical instruments called cats. The Sham wasn't the only person who was given information on the United Irishmen, or on the Pill Lane Committee. The Under Secretary Cook received other reports, and the regicide influences in here again. A guy called Left Hand, no idea what his real name was. He reported that Oliver Cromwell Bond, Henry Jackson, Pat Ewing, and Dr. William Drennan were meeting almost every night. He added knowingly, for what purpose such meetings are held, it's easy to guess. Now, whoever Left Hand was, amongst other things, he was definitely an informer, and he was also a lawyer, because there was no way at this stage that William Drennan would have been involved in the underground United Irishmen. William Drennan had narrowly escaped a charge of seditious libel the year previously, and had withdrawn from the society, and actually didn't agree with an underground movement of the sort that Bond and Jackson were trying to make. So whoever else was at those meetings, William Drennan wasn't at the meetings. The informer was putting him there for his own reasons. But the Oliver Cromwell Bond is very interesting. There are a number of references to Oliver Cromwell, by informers in particular, as Oliver Cromwell Bonds. And I have been unable to find out whether that was really his name or not. I suspect it wasn't his name. I suspect his name was Oliver Bond. But even that, okay, his father may have been an admirer of the original Oliver Cromwell. He was hardly an admirer of Oliver Plunkett. So it wouldn't. So that probably would. But I've no idea whether Oliver Bond's his name was Oliver Bond or his name was Oliver Cromwell Bond. Whether that was just hyperbole by his enemies' films. He was also, Oliver Cromwell Bond was also holding a treasonable correspondence with Reverend William Steele Dixon of Portaferry, a well-known Unitarian clergyman. Reverend William Steele Dixon is a hugely important figure both in the history of the United Irishmen in Northern Ireland and in the history of Presbyterianism in Northern Ireland. William Steele Dixon should have been. He was educated at Glasgow University. He was a student of Adam Smith, the famous economist, who, by the way, is often distorted by right-wing economists as if he was some sort of modern-day neoliberal. Adam Smith was a relatively decent man with a benign social philosophy as well as being a good economist. But William Steele Dixon was one of his pupils. Steele Dixon was Adjutant General of the Army of United Irishmen in County Down, and should have actually led them at the Battle of Ballynahinch and probably Saintfield as well. But in fact he was arrested, like Oliver Bond and so on, he was arrested before the rebellion, and his place was taken at Ballynahinch by the unfortunate Henry Munro. Now we want to talk so far we've been talking about these guys, by the way, who were down as weavers and glovers and all the rest of it. They were business people. They were employers. I want to say something about the workers in Pill Lane now. Many of Jackson's foundry workers lived in Church Street, and I'm quoting from the Sham, I think, this is the Sham again, would often assemble at George Tavern in Church Street and at the gateway to that inn for the purposes of rioting. Jackson's employees were very careful and only met in groups of 3 or 4. No minutes are taken, and all communications are by word of mouth. And I thought that was and I thought it might be useful to put in something here from a guy called John Telwell, who was very involved in the revolutionary and reform movement in Britain at this time. John Telwell said, every large workshop and manufactory is a sort of political society which no act of parliament can silence and no magistrate can disperse. The Sham describes the artisans of Pill Lane as low, that's always who comes into it, always low, right? Low, working class artisans, restless, drunken, riotous, capable of any mischief. And that's very typical of both the Sham himself and, as I was saying earlier on, this is the way the ruling class thought of ordinary people in those days. But the Sham says they are something above the common rabble. They are now reading newspapers and Paine's politics of liberty and equality. They were the Sham bemoaned, talking of religious emancipation and union with England, quitting their avocations and associating in numbers. So even here you obviously have a situation where the working class in Dublin have been brought into the underground United Irish movement. And in fact, I was at a very interesting talk by a young PhD student in Trinity who's done a lot more work on this, and he's identified precisely how a lot of the trade unions that were existing in Dublin at the time and other workers' organisation were being brought in by the Pill Lane group into the what became the United Irish conspiracy. A little bit about the chronology of what happened here in 1798. First, we got to the 12th of March that year. Oliver Bond, in his house across the way, in his big house across the river, he's having a meeting of the Leinster Society of United, the Leinster Directory of the Society of United Irishmen. It's raided by Major Sir again. They're all captured. They're all taken into custody and kept in custody. About the same time, something similar is going on with the leadership of the Belfast United Irishmen. They're captured and taken down to Dublin and all lodged in a growing number of state prisoners. Citizen Edward, I said Lord Edward there, that was a slip. Citizen Edward escapes the net on this occasion. And by this stage, himself and Samuel Nielsen, who's come down from Belfast, I think initially as a prisoner, but for some reason he's at liberty. Himself and Samuel Nielsen decide that the rebellion is going to take place on the 23rd of May. On the 16th of May, Lord Edward is moving around he's moving around Dublin. He's moving from house to house, 1 foot ahead of the authorities, as it were, and he goes to move to a house of a guy called Mangan on Russia's Island, just across the river. Mangan, as it turns out, is in the pay of the Sham Squire, so the castle are tipped off. So as Lord Edward is going down Watling Street, Major Sir tries to arrest him, but Lord Edward at this point, or Citizen Edward at this point, has a fairly elite bodyguard around him. Samuel Nielsen is there, William Putnam McCabe is there, Felix Rourke is there. Felix Rourke fights at the Battle of Tara later, and he's executed with Robert Emmet. He's executed in Naas with Robert Emmet in 1803. A guy called Joe Palmer is there. Palmer survives the rebellion but is drowned in a drowning accident in France, I think. But his aunt Robert Emmet is arrested in his aunt's house in 1803 after Robert Emmet's rebellion. But these guys are pretty formidable guards, and in fact bodyguards, and Sir is very lucky to escape with his own life. Never, he didn't capture Lord Edward that night. But he nearly ended up losing his own life because Palmer jumped on him, stabbed him a couple of times, but Sir was wearing body armour and he survived. The next night, Lord Edward is captured in Murphy's of Thomas Street. You saw the scene at the beginning of this presentation. He's badly wounded during the arrest, and he dies on the 4th of June in Newgate Prison, as I say, not too far from here. On the day, the idea for the plan of the rebellion was this: basically, the rebels were to muster in open spaces like Smithfield in Dublin. They were to stop the stagecoaches leaving Dublin. So if the stagecoach didn't arrive in Kildare at its usual time, or didn't arrive in Kilkenny at its usual time, or didn't arrive in Meath at its usual time, everybody knew the balloon had gone up, and everybody's orders were basically, in places like Wexford and so on, they were to make for the high ground and basically hold that until the French came. But when Lord Edward is arrested and dying, a lot of the people begin to think that he was obviously sold out, and there was a lot of suspicion. Everybody was suspicious of everybody else. How was he found? Who sold him out? In fact, years after the events, when our friend Archibald Hamilton Rowan is a very old man, Thomas Moore, the bard, friend of Robert Emmet and the bard and so on, wrote a book, The Life of Lord Edward Fitzgerald, and in it he suggested that Samuel Nielsen had actually sold Citizen Edward to the authorities. Archibald Hamilton Rowan was he was in his 80s, and he was within a year or two of his death. He wrote to Moore, and he wrote to the newspaper saying this was a scurrilous attack on an honourable man. Samuel Nielsen had died of yellow fever about 1802, I think, in New York. But Archibald Hamilton Rowan writes to the papers to exonerate Moore, Nielsen, and Moore accepted that Rowan was right. I don't know whether they had a 30-year rule or what the rule was in those days in relation to intelligence reports, but it was only when the intelligence reports were opened generations after that we realised it was Mangan and the Sham Squire who were responsible for Edward's capture. But at the time, as the time comes towards the rebellion, a lot of people are very worried that there's informers, and there are obviously, but even at the centre of the organisation. Samuel Nielsen gets himself arrested outside Newgate trying to capture or to spring Edward Fitzgerald, and then by the 23rd, the leadership in Dublin is more or less decimated. When the rebels come here, or try to come here to Smithfield, they find that the military are already in occupation. And the only sort of sign of what might have been is the next day, when all around the lanes of this area and the side streets of this area, there were pikes and other weapons discarded. So Bond is in jail at this time. He's been in jail since the 12th of May, and the government then decide any of the rebel leaders that they have any evidence against, they're going to execute. So first of all, they try and execute the Shears brothers. And again, any of you who know St. Mickens there, you'll see there's a plaque to the Shears. They're buried down there too. The Shears brothers are buried in St. Mickens. But and then it was Bond's turn. So Bond is tried and sentenced. And I think it's worth reading the sentence out to you. You, Oliver Bond, are to be taken from this place in which you stand to the jail from whence you came, and there to the common place of execution, there to be hanged by the neck, but not until you are dead. For while you are yet living, your bowels are to be taken out and thrown in your face, and your head is to be cut off, and your head and your limbs to be at the king's disposal, and may the Lord have mercy on your soul. So that's how things were done in those days. However, he wasn't executed, because the leadership of the United Irishmen, the state prisoners, did a deal with the government, and the terms of the deal was that they would disclose their involvement in the whole struggle or whatever and in return they wouldn't be executed. The executions would stop and the prisoners would be sent to America. Eventually that agreement was wedged on. It may have been that the Americans wouldn't accept such dangerous prisoners, but they eventually ended up, the people who survived went to, most of them for about 5 years, they went to Fort George in Scotland, including Reverends William Steele Dixon and Thomas Addison and some of the people that we've met earlier on. But it wasn't, Bond wasn't lucky enough, although he was pardoned, he wasn't lucky enough to be sent to Fort George. Bond was popular with the Dublin artisans, but he dangerous enemies were in the ruling elite, particularly Lord Carleton and Lord Kilwarden, who warmly urged the execution of Bond. He was found dead in his cell the day the pardon came through. The authorities claimed he died of natural causes. His family didn't dispute that. But one of his friends who came to see him said he was remarkably robust. He'd met him the day before, and he was remarkably robust and no more than 35 years of age at the time of his death. That's not quite true. He was 38 when he died in his 39th year. A friend at Pill Lane, a silk manufacturer, James Davok, had seen Bond in the prison yard the day before and found him in good health. William Drennan heard reports that Bond had been around this time collared his jailer and been clapped in irons as a consequence. On the night before his body was discovered, the prison was reported to be an uproar and some prisoners had barricaded their doors for fear of violence. I'm saying here sort of definitively that Bond was murdered by Simpson, the under jailer, on the orders of the Sham Squire. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that. I'm prepared to believe it, but of course we can't be certain. This is a very bad picture of Oliver Bond's headstone. Eleanor Jackson managed to retain Bond's considerable fortune, and she stayed around Dublin for about 10 years. Her father, Henry Jackson, had escaped and was in Baltimore in the USA, and she eventually went to Baltimore to join her father. Before she went, one of the last things she did was she put this headstone in St. Mickens. And she had a long time to think about what she was going to put on the gravestone. She made no reference at all. All she said was, Oliver Bond died in the 78th year of his, July 1798, in the 39th year of his life. She made no mention of the terrible events that had led to his death, no mention of his political involvement, no mention of his popularity with the Dublin working class and so on. She just simply said he was the noblest work of God, an honest man. Thanks for listening.